All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. It is our July 2021 Portals Community Call. The theme of today's episode. Oh, hey, Dilip, is that you?
That sounds like Dilip.
It's Jim. I don't know if he hears us. But anyway, as we get started here, we will work that out. In case you haven't noticed, we have a couple of special guests today, Nicholas and Dilip from Microsoft, as well as Nick Hayduk, our regular host and presenter. So glad to have all of them with us. Should be a fun event. The theme of today's session, Caching Deep Dive. We do welcome your questions. Look for the questions block in the interface. You can enter them at any time. And I'm sure Nick, Nikita, and Dilip will be happy to take those as well as present. So without any further delay, Nick Hayduk, let me hand things off to you.
Okay, sounds good. All right, yes, I'm very excited to have our couple of special guests here, right from the mothership, right from Microsoft. We got Dilip and Nikita, and I'll do some intros for them in a second. Just quickly jump into what we're going to be doing today, which is a deep dive into everyone's, other than licensing, I think caching is everyone's second favorite topic. So thought we would cover it here since it's something I've been dealing with over the last couple months here, kind of diving deeper into some of the caching aspects of the portal. So I thought, hey, that might make a good topic for the community call. So just a quick intro. If you don't know who I am, I'm Nicholas Hayduk, President and Software Engineer with Engineered Code Consulting Inc., Microsoft MVP, and been working with the platform now kind of close to 12 years now, starting off with ADX Studio, the original company that built the portals and was acquired by Microsoft. You can reach out to me on my LinkedIn, Twitter. I've got a blog, YouTube channel, and a podcast aptly named Refresh the Cache. That's how important this topic is. So moving on, just as always, want to acknowledge our good friends over at MS Dynamics World, in particular Jason, who helps out every month, gets the word out, helps us with the conferencing here, and is just an all-around great guy. And I am looking forward to, at some point, Jason, to seeing you in person again. Hopefully that's not too far out in the future. But yeah, the folks at MS Dynamics World, thanks as always for your support of this monthly call. So our agenda, we've got a little bit of news. Things are a little quieter these days, just with the summertime. So we've got some portals news, then we'll get into the deep dive in the caching. We'll talk about the date, time of the next community call, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A, which, yeah, excited to have some Microsoft folks here in case you have any questions, maybe not even caching related. So quickly into some portals news. I did see that there were some deprecations announced recently. So there's some changes and some deprecations. There is some new settings around some same site cookie modes. That's probably a pretty implementation specific. I don't know how many people are going to need that on a day-to-day basis, but I'm sure there are some larger implementations or some implementations where the security team may have some requests about how cookies are being handled. So there have been some nice changes, just more configurability to kind of change things the way that you want. And some tracking, the web page tracking, web file, and login tracking. They announced that they are being retired, which if I'm reading between the lines there, is that, that functionality was deprecated quite a while ago. Someone at Microsoft can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming what that means is that the functionality is actually being removed from the portal completely. So even if you wanted to use it, you couldn't use it. So, but yeah, that has been deprecated for performance reasons for years and years now. So, as well as there is, one way to kind of keep up to date on what's going on in the world of portals is checking out the release notes. So I just have a link here to the release notes for version 9.3.6. There's always, if you look through the release notes, I know that Dilip and his team are spending a lot of time always on accessibility. So there's always a lot of accessibility stuff, but there's always little kind of whether they're bug fixes or just little enhancements that are coming in, not entire features, but just, I know there was one recently for if you're doing a web form, the web form metadata about creating records in a lookup pop-up, kind of always pointed back to a web form, which maybe doesn't make a lot of sense. So that was one of those things that was cleaned up recently. So little kind of nuggets that you'll find if you kind of go through the release notes and see, the little changes that are going out that are kind of separate from the big releases. So, and that's really all I had for news for this particular call, unless there was something that Nikita or Dilip, if you have anything that you wanted to share news-wise about portals, feel free to jump in at any point. But otherwise, I'm going to get right into our topic for today, which is the portals caching deep dive. And before I dive into that, I do want to kind of formally introduce our guests here. So we have two guests. We've got Dilip Singh, who is, Dilip, I'm not sure what your title is these days, but basically the master of portals. He is the guy that's kind of the lead for portals at Microsoft. And he is also one of the nicest guys that you'll ever meet. Super, super helpful. Always kind of answering my emails at weird times of days. So Dilip, I'm really, really happy that you're able to join us today.
Hey guys. I hope you can hear me.
Yep, we can.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, it's really great to be here, Nick. Like I've been an avid follower of these community calls every week, so I'm like super excited to be here today. And thanks for all the nice words. Like right back at you. Like
would you say this maybe is the highlight of your career, being a guest on the community call? I mean,
I have. Yeah. This is something I'm gonna tell my 1-year-old daughter that this is something.
Yeah, so super happy to have you here around, especially on a topic like this where, I mean, a lot of us, I mean, even as an MVP, we don't really get to see all the behind the scenes of how this works. So we can kind of make some educated guesses based on our experience, but some of these things, Dilip, you might be able to kind of give us some deeper insight. And then our other guest that we have, Nikita Polikov, I believe former MVP, now a blue badge with Microsoft. I believe, Nikita, you're on Fast Track team and with a specialty in portals. So you and I go back a number of years now, where we were introduced by a mutual friend and colleague. Yeah, Nikita, you kind of live and breathe portals as part of the Fast Track team. Is that right?
I do. So, and actually, just recently, we're investing in success of portals broader. So, if you heard of the Power Cat team. In the Power Cat team where I just moved, we now have a Portals Cat team. So I'm stoked about that as a longtime Portals fan. Also on the call, we got Donovan Good. He's a peer of mine. So there's 2 Portal Cats now in the customer advisory team at Microsoft designated to focusing on portals, patterns and practices, and overall success. So lots more to come from our end this year. So.
No, that's great news. I mean, everything, I mean, I know, Dilip, sometimes when you kind of show your hockey stick graphs of the uptake of portals, and I know we've never been busier, and yeah, it's a very exciting, as they always say, it's a very exciting time to be a Power Apps Portals partner. So, okay, well, let's get into our topic today, and let's talk about Power Apps Portals caching. So, if you're not familiar with what caching is essentially remembering the results of expensive operations rather than performing them again. So in this particular case with Power Apps Portals, typically the expensive operation is making a call from the portal web application back to Dataverse. But caching can be used in all sorts of different ways. You may have like a complex algorithm that you don't want to run every time. So rather than running that, you may cache the results of it. But essentially it's, rather than doing that thing that's going to take a really long time, we're going to just remember what the answer was recently, and we'll just use that until we think, hey, maybe that answer is different. And so again, with Power Apps Portals, the idea is that we are caching the queries that are being sent back to Dataverse so that we don't have to make those calls over and over and over again. If you've ever cleared the cache on a portal and loaded up for the first time, that first time is not overly fast, as it has to, figure out the header and the footer and the navigation and the sitemap and all these different things that it has to calculate based on data it's getting from Dataverse. So there are all those queries that it has to do. And if it had to do those every single time someone loaded the page, that wouldn't be great. And any web application should be heavily relying on caching to increase performance, and Power Apps Portals is no different. So just to kind of put those words into a picture, you've got the user who's accessing the Power Apps Portal, which is essentially an application that's hosted in Azure and essentially an Azure web app. If you think of your traditional kind of web app architecture, you have a web server and you have your database server. So it's very similar concept here, except for the web server is your Power Apps Portal and your database is Dataverse. So again, the user makes a request to the portal. In order for the portal to say display your list of cases in your help desk, it's going back to Dataverse to get that data. Now again, that may not be the fastest experience if we have to go back to Dataverse every time. So what happens in reality or in practice is that there's a layer of caching between the portals and Dataverse. So essentially, the portal asks questions to Dataverse, but once it gets the answer to those questions, it will remember the answer to those questions and not ask them again until it decides that, hey, maybe that's maybe that's not the right answer anymore, and that's kind of where we get into some of the trickiness. So again, the user makes a request to the portal. The portal, instead of going to Dataverse every single time, will remember some of those queries. So when we talk about refreshing the cache, clearing the cache, killing the cache, all these different ways to say, what you're doing is you're telling the portal, hey, forget everything you know and go back to Dataverse for everything. So if everything's ever get out of sync, you clear the cache, it will go back to Dataverse. But again, then you'll see the performance implications of not having a cache, where it can take 30 seconds, a minute, whatever it is for your portal to load up for the first time, depending on the complexity of the page. So that's what we're trying to avoid, is that performance issues by implementing caching. So caching, so like I said, caching is great. It increases speed. And another important thing is that it reduces calls to Dataverse. So not only do we not have to make those calls, but they don't consume, they don't kind of tax the Dataverse. And you might be familiar with the service protection limits that are now included as part of Dataverse. So another reason, not only do you get performance by having caching, you also reduce the load on the Dataverse server, and you reduce the service or the number of API calls, which kind of gives you more room within the service protection limits for all the other apps that you're trying to run. So basically, it makes portals in the neighborhood that is your Dataverse application world. It makes portals a very not noisy neighbor and kind of keeps the traffic down from portals, so other things can be using up your entitlement. Now, of course, caching is great until something changes in Dataverse. So the big challenge with caching is what happens if there's a change made in Dataverse, directly to Dataverse through the API, through a model-driven app, essentially any way that doesn't go through the portal. So what that means is that if you make a change directly in Dataverse, your portal doesn't know that that change has been made. So now you have an invalid or a stale cache. So how does the portal know that, oh, something's changed? Well, that's the whole idea of trying to properly invalidate the cache. But again, if you make changes on the portal, if you are using an entity form, or sorry, a basic form on the portal, you insert a record, and then you go to a list that shows that record, you'll see it there right away, because all of that is kind of going through the caching mechanism of the portal. It knows that that exists, and it's able to kind of keep track of, okay, these things kind of depend on that particular record. So for example, you create a case, the portal's smart enough to be like, oh, you created a case, so maybe the queries I have related to case, okay, maybe I need to kind of requery those and get those added to my thing. So the portal tries to be smart about the things that it knows, but the things that it doesn't know, if you make an edit directly in the backend database somehow, again, model-driven app, via API, that sort of thing, the portal just simply won't be aware of it. So what do we do in those cases? So let's talk about the long, complicated history of where cache invalidation was and where we are now. So when this first kind of came out as ADX Studio portals way back in the day, more than 10 years ago, one of the first ways that ADX Studio attempted to solve this problem was through creating plugins, and they eventually became asynchronous plugins when that became a thing. So asynchronous plugins that fire when records are updated in, back then it was Dynamic CRM, but now we know it's Dataverse. So when those records were updated, it would fire the plugins, and that plugin would send a notification to the portal that says, hey, a record with this ID has been updated in the back end. Forget what you know about that particular record, and if it was a new record, forget what you know about those particular queries. So this was in small, in small quantities, it worked fine. The challenge is that and you could even configure it. You could say, hey, I want to add the plugin to these certain entities and these certain fields. But the challenge quickly was when you'd have a lot of records. So let's say you wanted to, if someone makes an update to a contact record, you want the portal to be updated. That's a pretty common request. Well, what happens when someday someone imports a spreadsheet of 50,000 contacts? Now you have 50,000 plugins firing. They're sending 50,000 requests to your portal pretty much instantaneously. And now not only is your async service overwhelmed, but your portal is overwhelmed with all these requests telling it to forget everything it knows. So again, at smaller scale, it worked, but large scale, it could sometimes be, it basically could bring down the portal pretty quickly. So while that was what was in place when Microsoft acquired the product, when Microsoft released their own version of it, that's when things changed a little bit. So rather than relying on plugins and the async service and notifications, what happened is there was a new feature in Dataverse or CDS at that time that was introduced called change tracking. So rather than having to create a plugin that would notify the portal, change tracking was kind of this built-in mechanism that could send events off to these different places. So the idea here is that you would enable change tracking on your entities when changes were made to those records. It would send a notification to, I believe it was some sort of like event hub type thing, and then those events were consumed by the portal, and the portal could kind of keep up to date. And so that was essentially the first kind of implementation that we saw from Microsoft, where we were using the change tracking. So often people, you'd see on the forums, hey, I added my custom entity to the portal, but when I change something in the back end, nothing ever shows up on the portal. And the fix for that was go enable change tracking for that entity. Without the change tracking, the portal won't know about it. So that was kind of their first version. The next version we had was there was kind of a split. So there was kind of some record types, so some tables were deemed to be, hey, this is important, but it probably doesn't change a whole lot. So we're not going to really rely on, we're not going to really, do the change tracking thing, because these record types they don't change that often. They're really changing more during the development side of things, and not really a kind of on a everyday once the portal is in production. So a lot of the record types here would be things like the ADX underscore entities. So things like, entity lists and the entity form and ADX underscore web form, those types of records, web pages, essentially these configuration entities. There's also some non-ADX entities, so like views and forms and some other metadata there that were essentially the portal would cache those indefinitely. So there was really nothing you could, there was no kind of timing mechanism to say, clear the cache on these things. It essentially had to be done. It had to be done manually. So, which again wasn't that was never a huge kind of problem. It did mean that you kind of had to have that clear cache button ready when you're doing development. So it was much more of a problem in development, or it just kind of made it a little bit more challenging in development, because you kind of always had to be clearing the cache. And now, but for any entity that kind of wasn't in that list, or any table that wasn't in the list of here are the known config entities, they were all just kind of cached, and really the SLA for that cache was within 15 minutes, your changes, if made in the backend, should show up in the portal. So it's not, instantaneously. You don't make a change in the backend and all of a sudden it's on the portal. It didn't rely on anything like change tracking or plugins or anything like that. It was just more of a kind of a time-based expiration of those cached records, and within 15 minutes, those records should show up in the portal. So that's kind of where we were for quite a long time. But then there was one change a little bit more recently, and so this is kind of the current mechanism. And so the current mechanism is somewhat of a combination of the first two. So it's still, there's kind of the definition of here are the config tables versus here are the kind of more data tables. So the config tables, what they've reintroduced is the change tracking on those. So if you make changes to those, the portal will be notified about those and get updated relatively quickly about those config tables. The reason we really like that is when we're using tools like the XRM Toolbox to update our web templates, or if we're using the new command line, the Power Apps CLI command line interface. When we use those tools to then update these records, before we'd always have to kind of clear the cache. Now with the change tracking re-added to those config tables, you'll see those changes on the portal. But what remains the same way is pretty much anything that's not on that list. And if you're interested in what that list is, there is a blog post that has a list of, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 tables that are the ones that are considered config. Anything that's on that list still kind of is subject to the SLA of, within 15 minutes, this record type. If you make a change in the backend, within 15 minutes, you should see it on the portal. So it is not real time, but it is, within 15 minutes, which is, as compared to where we were when it was first launched, where it could take days because sometimes the invalidation just didn't happen properly, and then we didn't have the ability to clear the cache. We spent a lot of our time rebooting web servers, and that was just not a fun way to develop Power Apps portals. So, Dileep or Nikia, anything to add to the history here? I'm sure I've gotten lots wrong, but you can point out all the places where you think you can add some value there.
No, that's a good overview, Nick. Like I totally forgot we went through so many iterations. I think one of the things to add to and this was like historical context. Like plugins were like a good way when we had started out, but one of the big challenges you will run into is in SaaS world, like especially when we started hosting the portals, it's not a single server, and all of this cache is per server. So which means when you are invalidating through mechanism like a plugin, which makes a HTTP call to do the invalidation, you can only do it on one particular server. And then there was like an internal mechanism of how changes propagate across multiple servers in our server farm. And those methods were always very, very expensive because they'll write it to a disk, and then through disk, like other servers will read. And disk communications is like in virtual, like in IaaS world, like most of the disks are like network calls, which means like it's not very reliable to depend on the disk, especially when there could be like very, very large amount of changes happening in small time. So that's where when we went to this whole change tracking mechanism, we internally used a pub sub model. We still use it for all the config entries, where there is an event hub in place where we read it from, and then we write it to a topic, to a service bus topic, and each of the portal servers run sort of like a subscription to that topic. So whenever a message comes, like all the servers will read it at the same time, perform the action, and then the message gets deleted from the topic. So the publisher subscriber model, that's the model how change tracking works, and it scales for like multiple servers at once as well. So just to add that, I think the one other thing which is very interesting is, although publicly we always state our SLA is 15 minutes, after this new mechanism where we actually do it on timer based, the time could actually, like for most of the tables which are frequently changed, you will see it between 5 to 7 minutes. For the tables which are infrequently changed, that's where it can take up to 15 minutes. But for all practical purpose data which change commonly, like you will see it within like 5 to 7 minutes.
Great. No, I'd almost completely forgotten about back in the day when we would host our portals in the old kind of cloud. What did they call them? Cloud apps or whatever they were. And then you'd scale to multiple, and then you had to set up the inter process communications, because you're right, the request that only one server would receive the invalidation request, so then it would have to communicate that with the other one and setting that all up. And oh man, that was a pain. I'd blocked that out, so thanks for bringing that up again.
Yeah, no, that was a bad memory for me.
Yeah. All right, cool. So so we've talked about kind of the history. We've talked about kind of why we need caching. Now let's talk about like what, in kind of practical every day when you're working on Power Apps portals. What can we do about the cache? Because when you're developing Power Apps portals, even if it was 5 to 7 minutes, which is great, you don't really want to wait 5 to 7 minutes for any of those things to change. And even for the config entities, yes, they're pretty quick, but sometimes you just need to tell that portal, forget everything you know. So there are a couple of ways to do it. Now the key here is this is for development. You want to avoid doing this on your production portals, but as you're working and building out your portal in a test or a dev environment, these are tools that I basically, when I'm working on a portal, I've got my different browser windows open, and one of them always has one of these two buttons on there. So one of them is on your portal itself. So if you go to whatever your portal URL is, /services/about. Now you need to be logged in as someone with the administrator's web role. If you have that, then you will see some buttons there. One of which is clear cache. So there's a clear config, there's a rebuild search index, and there's a clear cache button. So that was kind of the go-to for many, many, many years. I don't use it quite as much as I used to, because oftentimes I'm trying to build portals without being logged in as the administrative user, because the front side editing capabilities can somewhat change the look and feel of your portal. So I may not always be logged in with someone who isn't an editor. So there is another way to clear your cache, and that is by using the Portal Studio. So the Portal Studio is the interface that you can access if you go into make.powerapps.com. You find your portal app and you click the edit button, and it brings up that nice new interface that Dilip and his team have been working on. That kind of a WYSIWYG citizen developer type interface that has a bunch of new functionality, like editing your table permissions. That's fantastic. The theming, a bunch of cool features in there. But within there, in the top right-hand corner, there is a Browse Website button. If you click that button, your cache for your portal will be cleared as well. So that's kind of my go-to these days, is I'll have Portal Studio open. I use Portal Studio all the time for doing the entity or the table permissions now. And I'll just have that open, and I'll click the Browse Website button, and that will clear the cache for me. Now, speaking specifically about Portal Studio, you can think of, in the same way that the Power Apps portal itself is a separate web application, you can think of Power Up or Portal Studio as another web application. So when you make changes in the back end, you kind of also have to consider that Portal Studio itself kind of has its own caching built in. So that's why beside the Browse Website button, you'll see the Sync Configuration button, which is kind of the kill cache for the Studio. So if you hit that button, it will pull kind of the latest data from Dataverse if you're making changes directly in Dataverse. Other things that I just wanted to mention here was if your queries contain a parameter that's always changing. So a good example of this would be the current time. So if you include the current time in your queries, your query will not be cached. And that's because every time it runs, it will look at the parameters. So if you look at the cache, the way that the queries get cached, it has to obviously take into account what were the parameters of that query. So if you put in something that's always changing, that will not ever get cached. So we've used that in a few cases where we need to, there's one particular call that needs to be up to date all the time, getting some sort of important, safety information. You can do the query and say, create it on less than the current time. Well, that query will not get cached, and that will get pulled every time. So I don't recommend that you use that use that sparingly, because again, we like the cache, we want the cache, but there's some cases where you need to figure out a way to get around that cache, because there is no programmatic way to clear the cache. There's no way to send a request somewhere to do that, except for if you think about using the new web API. Now, there's nothing in the web API that says, hey, clear the cache for the website. However, if you update a record via the web API, well, that's going to tell the portal that it's going to get the latest details back from Dataverse. So my good friend Nick Dolman does have a blog post about using the web API to clear the portal's cache. Again, this is more of a precision. Think of it as in a very specific instances, if you need for whatever reason for a particular record for its cache to get invalidated, you can perform an update on it via the web API, and you should see that it gets updated. But again, this is a tool for very limited circumstances. It's not a general like, oh, let's update every record so that every record is updated all the time. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that there are other levels of caching as well. So we've really focused on the caching from the portal to Dataverse. But when you think of web applications in general, there are lots of layers of caching. So when you're not seeing something being updated, you can almost guarantee there's a cache problem, but you never quite know where the caching might be occurring. So like your browsers will cache things. So if you have created a web file for like a JavaScript resource as a web file, and you update it in the back end and you've cleared the cache and you refresh your page and you're like, why isn't this working? What's broken with the portal cache? Well, it may not be your portal cache. It could be the fact that the browser is caching that JavaScript file. So going into your developer tools, when I'm working on a portal, I always have my developer tools open and I'm always checking off the disable browser cache, because yeah, your browser is going to heavily try and cache things as well. Because typically when you're not in development, typically JavaScript files aren't changing. So it's smart of browsers to cache them, just something we have to get around as we develop these portals. Another thing would be that the header and footer also have some output caching. So output caching is more not at the query level, but more of the what is the resulting HTML for the header and footer web template. So there's some caching that can be turned off. I'm glad it's by default on now, but there are other layers of caching as well that you always have to be kind of aware of when you're working on these portals. The big one that everyone talks about is the one that we've been kind of focused on, which is the layers of, or the layer back to Dataverse. But caching is a notoriously challenging subject, so it comes up quite a bit.
And just to add there, right? Like you can basically imagine it as 4 kind of caches. One is your query cache, which is the data which we call from Dataverse, it get cached for a particular user and for that particular query. The second is configuration cache, which is all the metadata for portals, like including pages, forms, like all of that gets cached, just so that we don't are getting like while rendering the pages, we don't have to query it again and again. Then you have output caches. Output caches actually exist for all pages along with header and footer. But why they are very, very interesting for header and footer is because header and footer are common across all the pages. So if we do not do header and footer output caching, which means that for every single page, we are reevaluating the header, and your header could have web links in it, and web links could be dynamic based on roles. So which means like it could be a very, very expensive operation to go and evaluate all of that for every single page, rather than just doing it once and using it like till the time like there's a change being done. That's why header and footer cache helps really, really like they are really good for ensuring the scalability for portal. And then last you see is client caching, which is like everything which get cached on browsers, which is where like all the static content like CSS, images, JavaScript, like they get cached there, which is a pain for while you're doing development. Like that's where the techniques which Nick mentioned are very, very useful. But it's not a problem when it is running out in production. Like that's where you do need those things to be cached, so that if you have like images which are like MB each, you're not loading those images every time for every user. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
Great. Yeah, no, that's caching. It's I think there's an old like saying about like there's two things that are hard in programming, and it's like naming things and caching or something like that. So I see we had a question, but it looks like Nikita, thank you for answering that. Essentially the question was, is there a way to deliberately invalidate the cache for a particular non-configured record without invalidating the entire cache? The answer is no. There's really no way to invalidate that, unless Dileep, were you going to announce the web service today for invalidating the cache however we want? Was that on your list of things to do today?
No.
Oh, no.
So it's a very tricky. Like we have been debating that for some time, but it is very, very tricky. Like if someone misconfigured it, or is not using it in right manner, it will lead to a situation where like you are just invalidating it after every single call, and the portal is never performant. So that's the biggest thing we have, that hey, should we give it like an all-powerful tool for someone to do it? Because we have seen customers do it. Like we have seen customer hack their way around and like hit that button on services about page. And what that leads to is, even with like 10 user on portal, like their portal tanks down, right? Just because every single page load, they were making a clear cache call. So that's where it's very, very tricky. And that's where like some of these like kind of patterns exist where you really need to see the data live from Dataverse, like the mechanism you said about using a dynamic parameter in a query, which changes every time. Like those mechanisms are very useful for like those situations today. And that's where we feel are probably it does encapsulate all the various scenarios which exist. But as we go along and we see more and more of use cases, we might be tempted to go provide some mechanism to either like reduce the caching time for a particular entity or something like that, but at least not in immediate short term that we are thinking about anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's one of those things. Well, Philippe, you and I are working on one right now where just because of the resources assigned to the portal, the cache basically didn't work, and you went from 17, it would take 17 seconds to load a page, and you hit the refresh button and you think, oh, the cache is gonna make it easier the second time. It's like, nope, because just because of the way that it was configured, it wasn't quite right. But as soon as we got the caching figured out, it goes to like, sub 2 second page loads, which is quite an improvement over 17 seconds. So yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. Dileep, I'll speak on your behalf. I'm assuming if people have non-caching related questions, you'd be maybe open to answering some of those as well. So if people have any questions, please go ahead and post them in the questions block here. Just quickly, the date of the next call here will be August 26th. So that's kind of almost 6 weeks from now, because this one was kind of a week early and that one's kind of a week late because I'm on vacation. As I like to do every single time, multiple times, thank Jason and his team. I also really want to thank Nikita and Dileep for joining us today. Not only did they join us during the call here, but they spent a bunch of time over the last few days, reviewing slides and giving feedback on the presentation. So that was super helpful. We got a lot more accurate information, a lot better information into this because of their input. Like I said, some of these details, especially things like caching, it's almost like a black box to us. So unless we can talk to the people who are behind the scenes and can see what's going on, we can kind of guess as to what's going on, but it's really just great to have that insight. So I'll open up the floor to questions here. I see we got another one from Mike, or maybe a follow-up. in that a use case is that a record is created in Dataverse by a D365 user and sends an email using Flow to the portal contact, asking them to log into the portal to see this record. If the portal logs in immediately, they can't see the record. Yeah. Yeah, I know we run into caching concerns quite often when we're using a companion app or companion API structure where it's like, I'd like to do as much as I possibly can using the out-of-the-box tools, but sometimes because of integration scenarios, I have to go out and use a companion app. But if I create a record through that companion app, it's not necessarily always available immediately on the portal. So I'm sure, we can certainly understand why we don't want to just give that power out. But yeah, I can think of a lot of great use cases for being able to, very selectively say, hey, this one entity, I just want to get invalidated cache for this one entity. So again, the web API may be your friend there if you want to check out Nick Dolman's blog post. Yeah. Let's see here. So are there any other questions?
Like
Oh, sorry, what was that?
I was gonna say, quick suggestion. Now that you know the SLA for cache, you can just build in a wait period into your notifications.
That's
right?
a great point.
If that's so critical, right, that you want to make sure that when the customer gets the notification that something is ready for them in the portal, then just built in that wait, right? Anywhere from that 5 to 15 minutes into your flow. I mean, obviously, there can be better things that the cloud compute can be used for, but now that you know the portal architecture, you can be angry at it, or you can just be, address it within your design. And that's just one way to address this built in that way. The other one is just frankly user education as well. So, from pattern and practices perspective, you just need to make sure that you understand this, the customer understands this, you explain to the customer to accept the reality of cache, right? You can be upset about it or design with the fact that it exists there. And that's where it's important to just make sure it's just considered to be part of the design you need to accomplish for your system.
Yep.
I actually wanted to maybe pause. We'll wait for more questions and actually just talk about some of the common use cases as well. I didn't have time to just toss them all into slides, but I'll want to maybe bring up a few examples.
Yeah, absolutely.
So any questions? Anybody want to get off mute and ask theirs via voice?
I don't know if they have I think they have to ask them via the chat because this is.
Yeah, it has to come in through chat.
Okay. Yep. Well, as you're typing, let's think of common use cases, right? Obviously, let's think of Dynamics 365 customer self-service use cases, right? Or our famous template there for a portal for customer self-service, right? When you think of the use case of a customer service agent updating something in Dynamics and Dataverse, right? You are going to not see that in real time on the portal. So when they're on the phone and somebody's looking on a case on the portal, you need to make sure that those customer support agents are trained to know that, hey, they will definitely get somebody at some point to say, hey, I don't see this change live on the portal. They need to tell them that, hey, it's going to appear in the portal within 15 minutes. It needs to be a part of customer service training. If it's not, then everybody's just frustrated and wondering why that's happening and presuming. It's truth, and you just need to make sure it's part of the training. So the use cases could be as simple as, hey, I got a self-service portal, I call in, as the customer rep is making changes or closing that case or updating my profile, I'm not going to see that reflected immediately. They just need to know that that's going to be the reality of it. Now, vice versa, one of the scenarios that comes in more often, and it's a little puzzling sometimes, is let's say you create a case, but you've got some business logic or automation that happens asynchronously after you create a case. Whether it be maybe a case subtype or category or something or routing rule, right? That happens after the case create. Now, Portal created the case real time, right? Which means it created the case, which now is in the Portal's cache because it created it from it in the rest of the data. But you might not see something you might assume that happens more real time, where it really isn't even real time, where it's maybe an async flow or workflow or an async plugin. If those things happen, or maybe a transformation rule, right? If those things happen, you won't see that data change in Portal in as real time as you might imagine, right? So as you're developing a portal, let's say you have a filter of activity type or something else on your list of cases, you want to make sure that you're actually addressing that correctly as that's happening, because you might not see the value of that field coming in real time. So what can you do about it? Well, you could potentially change some of that business logic to happen synchronously within that field itself. But there's a lot of pros and cons, probably usually more cons. One, you want to make sure you're very quick and efficient in what that business logic is doing and make sure it's happening as fast as possible, right? You don't want that plugin to do table seeks and comparison string searches, right? Because Portal does a transaction in Dataverse in real time, when you hit create from a Portal user, we're waiting on Dataverse to finish writing that record and release the transaction. If you got a plugin that calls an external web service and waits for it to return, and you won't release that create operation from the plugin, guess what happens? Your Portal user sees that real time. So now you've got kind of saying, well, why isn't our Portal running quick? After a few hours with support, eventually you'll get to the bottom line that says, well, it's because your plugin took 15 seconds and it was synchronous and it held the transaction. You can do the same thing with our classic workflows. Luckily, Flow is asynchronous at this stage, so you're probably not going to have issues with Flow. But you got to balance your architecture with the fact that now you know that the portal has cache, you know what the SLA is on the refresh of that data, and what scenarios you might have post-synchronous or synchronous activities come in or not into what's visible to the portal user, and design with those in mind. And some of them become maybe not as apparent to our developers as they're building the project or as they're layering more business logic onto what they're building on the portal. They might eventually get to a place where they are surprised and not seeing data. At that point, that's when they start asking questions. Well, hey, this is cached. Where's my cache button? Where's my reset cache button? How do I build it into my business logic to go clear the cache? And those are not always the right questions, right? It's just, you should have just been designing it with that knowledge in mind. So I know I've said a lot to kind of unpack that use case, but we can answer some questions on that. And it doesn't matter how you've logged in or who the user is when they're doing those activities either.
Great. Yeah. No, we've got a couple questions coming in here now. Let's see here. I think either one of you could probably answer this. I might even know the answer to this, but the question is about the version numbers that show up on the _services/about page. So I believe the version number, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the version number that shows up on that is the version number of the Portal web application. And that kind of gets updated kind of automatically as part of your typical release cycle. If you want to get kind of earlier rather than later, you can sign up for the early releases on those, and you'll kind of go earlier rather than later. And then in terms of the actual solutions, those are upgraded now. Are those now in the Power Platform Admin Center where you can upgrade your solutions? Is that where that lives now, Dilip? Or where's the best place to be upgrading the actual solutions associated with the portal? Because I believe that's a manual step. That's not done automatically for you, correct?
Yes, it's through Power Platform Admin Center. Like customers can go there and update a portal from there. Actually, okay. This is I don't know how to add it in the chat, but I'll try. Oops, sorry. Okay, I'll actually send like a doc link which explains the whole upgrade process and what these things are.
Okay.
We can include that in follow-ups to the audience too.
Yeah, I'll include it in the links that I send out. Another general question. Using Azure AD B2C, how do you disable user registration? The settings don't seem to work on the Azure AD B2C custom page. So that would be a case of turning off the local authentication as an identity provider in Azure AD B2C. So I think that would be the answer to that one. For customer care with portals, we need to configure workflows so that the user could interact with the data in the entity list. We expect to be able to choose Power Automate Cloud Flow to interact. Yeah, so that's essentially, I believe that's kind of, he's asking about, are there any plans on the roadmap to support Power Automate flows instead of the classic workflows in the lists and that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah, eventually we will. I think we are still trying to time it on when we will. Right now, the main aim is to make first the whole web API stuff work, because the way we are going to go approach this is in order to call Power Automate flows directly, we will also need to support the ability to call automate flows in a secured manner from portal. So we're going to enable it through web APIs. And once that is enabled, then all the buttons will just be switched over to use web APIs.
Ah, very smart. Okay. Are there any other questions or any other things that before I let everyone go? Again, Dileep, Nikita, thank you so much for helping out today. You've probably done a terrible thing. Now that you've done it once, you'll probably get invited back again. So you might have lots of stories for your kids, Dileep.
Hey, could I ask one question while we have you on the call today? A little bit unrelated to caching, but with the new release wave documents coming out, is there anything you'd call our audience's attention to for portals?
Sorry, Jason, can you repeat that again? Somehow got I could hear only like partial.
Okay, with the release wave 2 documents that were published this week, anything you would call the audience's attention to with regard to Power Apps portals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things you will see in release notes is like web API and PCF. Those are the two big things, like at least for this year. And there are like really great enhancements coming to both of those, especially web API, read and like the whole support for retrieve and retrieve multiple is going to be added. As well as like to do custom actions. Like that's the next phase of it, where like all the Dataverse custom actions you will be able to call through web API as well. And as I was talking about, then the next step will be, hey, how do we get flows like into that mix so that you are able to call like flows through the same mechanism. So this has been a very, very important thing for us, because this is also required for our PCF work, where today you're seeing PCF controls added on forms. What we are changing like pretty soon is we're going to be enhancing PCF support to not only add it on a form, like to replace a field, but you can just create your own form. Like you can create a full PCF control, place it on a page, similar to how you do it with Power BI or forms or list or charts or that. Like all of these components, like every PCF component will become available to place it on a web page. That will enable so many of these scenarios where you are able to ship, like get these controls from like Fluent library or someplace else, wrap it in PCF and just place it on portal to do like variety of custom scenarios. And all the security is still managed because you're using web API in it. And we will ensure that like the context.web API part of PCF gets automatically enabled for all the like portal web APIs. So moment the control is in portals, like the web API translate to start using portal portion of it. Unless there's like there will always be some delta that hey, these are the APIs which portal doesn't support, but those like slowly over the time will go up.
Awesome, thanks so much. Well,
all right. I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. Jason, I don't know if you have any parting words, but again, thanks to our special guests. Thanks for everyone for attending. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah, that's it for me too. Look for follow-up communications as we do every month. We hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.